Hi, everyone. This is my lecture on the causes and consequences of the War of 1812. So let's get into it. Okay, so during the early 1800 period, especially after the Louisiana Purchase, attacks on white settlers by Native Americans were going up. They were increasing, which seems reasonable as the country is expanding into what territory that had been previously held by Native Americans. However, Americans believed that the British were actually responsible for these Native American attacks, right? And basically they believed that the British were encouraging the Native Americans to attack the white settlers, right? And that's what this political cartoon here is showing, right? Like a British man paying a Native American person for the scalp of an American, right? So that was kind of the propaganda of the time. At the same time, Britain was interfering with American shipping and trade across the Atlantic into Europe. And this was partially because at this time, Britain was also fighting Napoleon, who was trying to essentially take over Europe. And so Britain needed a lot of resources to fight Napoleon. And one way of getting those resources and money was taking them from American ships. Britain, especially the British Navy during this time, also had the practice of what they called impressment. And that was basically where they would chase down a ship in their own ship and basically say, anyone who has deserted the British Navy has to come back and fight for us. And they were supposed to just limit it to people who were British, but they really didn't in practice. Pretty much like if they stopped you, you would be drafted into their navy. And that obviously made a lot of people unhappy, especially Americans who had emigrated from Britain and couldn't prove that they were Americans. So the US Congress passed what they called the Non-Intercourse Act, which basically banned trade with Great Britain. And that actually made it worse because it made the British angrier and it cut off a big source of money and supplies for America. So, after the Non-Intercourse Act is passed, the Americans in Congress who wanted war began arguing that the US should go to war against Britain. And remember, this is only a few years after the end of the Revolutionary War, which we were like against all odds successful against the British. So, a lot of people believe that this was another opportunity for America to really assert its independence. And often this is called the Second War for Independence. So in June of 1812, Congress declares war. And remember, from the Constitution, Congress is the body that gets to declare war. So they pass that resolution for the first time in American history. And Native Americans side with the British, right? As you might imagine, right? They are trying to stop the incursion of Americans into the land that Native Americans held, so they obviously will side with the British. Okay, so initially, the Americans do very poorly because remember at this time we didn't have what's called a standing military. We didn't have any military on call. Like during the Revolutionary War, our military was made up of small local militias. And Britain, again, still is the largest empire in the world, and they also have a huge and powerful navy. So initially, we do very poorly against the British, but win an early battle at Lake Erie that is the first major US victory. Okay, however, by 1814, Napoleon in France is defeated and the British can come now focus all of their attentions on America. So they actually invade Washington, D.C. in August of 1814, which is a huge deal, an invasion by an enemy power of the capital of our country. And they actually burn down most of the city, including the Capitol building and the White House. And the Capitol is where Congress is, right? So they basically burned down our capital, which is like a huge deal. That's like Canada now coming in and burning down D.C., right? Big, big deal. Um, in September in 1814, the British also attack Fort McHenry in Baltimore. At this point, the Americans actually managed to turn back the British at Baltimore, which is good. And this battle is more significant because it's there that Francis Scott Key actually writes the words to the Star Spangled Banner. So the bombs bursting in air, the rocket's red flare, those are all references to the War of 1812. And this is where our national anthem comes from. So he wrote the words, and then the music was actually a common folk song that people knew, right? So that's where our national anthem comes from. So by the end of 1814, basically both sides are exhausted and realize kind of that neither really wants to continue. The Americans have become successful enough to really turn back most of British invasion, and Britain is also in a huge amount of debt from the Napoleonic Wars. So neither side really wants to continue to fight. So at Christmas time in 1814, America and Britain signed the Treaty of Ghent. Ghent is a city in Belgium, and officially end the war. However, word does not get back to America quickly, right? Remember, all messages had to be sailed across the Atlantic and then taken by horse or by foot to various places. So it took a while for news to travel. So in January of 1815, US and British forces that were stationed in New Orleans and Louisiana didn't know that the treaty had ended the war. To them, the war was still going on. And in fact, the general of the American forces there, whose name was Andrew Jackson, leads Americans to a huge victory against the British. And Andrew Jackson becomes a national hero. And eventually, he is elected president, continuing the tradition of military heroes becoming president. So George Washington was the first, and then Andrew Jackson, and then we have many later. Ulysses S. Grant, who was a successful general of the Civil War. We have Dwight Eisenhower after World War II, right? All these military heroes become president, and kind of all that goes back to George Washington, but then also Andrew Jackson really makes it a tradition. And this actually, although this battle didn't really matter in the course of the war, because technically the war was already over, this gave a huge patriotic boost to America because they felt like they could really fight off Britain. Okay, while the Battle of New Orleans is going on and while the Treaty of Ghent is being signed, the Federalists, remember that political party I told you about, are holding a secret convention in Hartford to oppose the war. So remember, Federalists were the political party that wanted a strong central government, right? And they hated this war. They hated it. So basically, at this convention, they all get together and they actually try to change the Constitution. They try and do two things: eliminate the 3/5 clause, which we'll talk about later, but basically the 3/5 clause said that for the purposes of counting population for representation in Congress, a slave counted as 3/5 of a person. So basically they tried to eliminate that, which would drastically lower the amount of representation that slave states had. And also they wanted to change the way to declare war to require a 2/3 vote instead of just a simple majority vote. This makes them super unpopular, especially because right at the same time, the Battle of New Orleans is happening, which is a big success, right? They are seen as traitors and unpatriotic, and that really ends the influence of the Federalist Party in America. And after that, they pretty much die off. Okay, so significance of the War of 1812. Technically, neither the U.S. nor the Great British won the Great Britain, the British, won the war. Right? We signed a treaty, we ended it. No one really won. Right? However, the Native Americans definitely lost. Right? They lost a significant amount of land, and after this, as we'll look at this week, the Native American removal goes into high gear. And they actually are forced to sign over 200 treaties that take away their traditional and historical territory and give it to white settlers. And at this point, Britain basically withdraws all support from North America and basically says, we're done with North America and we're not going to support the Native Americans anymore. So they lose both land and resource and economic support from the British. So this is a huge blow for Native Americans. But even though the US didn't win the war, we got a lot out of it. Not only do our territory and power expand, but we also get the Northwest Territory, Oregon and Washington, from the US as a cession, right? And the idea that there was this idea that for a while they were going to create a Native American state kind of in between the Louisiana Purchase and like what's now California. And that's completely abandoned. And at this point, Manifest Destiny is really embraced wholeheartedly. And the idea that the US is going to become a continent-wide country really starts to come to the forefront, right? So at this point, really, we start expanding across the whole American continent. So that is the War of 1812. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you next time. Bye.